Hello, and may the 4th be with you, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. This video is a part of a series of videos, or an annual tradition, I may say, where every May 4th I review all of the Star Wars episode films in order of release date. So I started this tradition last year, and this year I continue with the second film to be released in the Star Wars saga, and that is Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. So, this film is generally known as, most people would say, and of course there's a few dissenting opinions, there's always dissenting opinions, but most people will say that this is the best film in the Star Wars saga. Particularly the best film in the original Star Wars trilogy, which sort of translates to the best film in the Star Wars saga because the prequels and sequels were not seen as good as the original trilogy. And again, dissenters, they always exist. But the majority opinion tend to think that this is the best Star Wars film. Now, I very much agree with that. In fact, I will take that even further. And this is a revelation I kind of came to last year when I watched the A New Hope, or Star Wars as it's actually called. I came to the revelation that The Empire Strikes Back is the only great Star Wars film. Now, that's of course an opinion I know many Star Wars fans will totally disagree with. But I've made no secret, and if you have any familiarity with my channel, you should know I've always been more of a Star Trek guy than a Star Wars guy. But I've always loved the Star Wars films, and I've always liked watching Star Wars. I never really got into the extended lore, all of the extended universe, which apparently is not considered canon anymore. Even the cartoons that are still considered canon, which I may get into those eventually. Stay tuned for that. But anyway, that is to say, looking back on it, because, and I did a whole video about this before, about a lot of the love for Star Wars, particularly the original trilogy, is due to nostalgia, and I think this is really illustrated, and I made this point when I talked about it in this video, about the difference between how critics, when this film first came out, saw the film, and how critics nowadays see it. Because nowadays it's considered like one of the best movies ever made. As I said, most people consider it the best Star Wars film, and it's always in your top 20, top 10 best movies of all time list for a lot of critics and a lot of audiences. It ranks quite highly as an all-time classic. And you look at the reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, for example. I didn't look up the percentage, but it's very very high. It's over 95%, if I recall. When this film first came out, if there was Rotten Tomatoes back then, which of course there wasn't, the critic score would have been more like somewhere between 50 and 65%. Maybe 70%. But people were more lukewarm on this film. And I remember looking up a lot of reviews when I was young. I would actually go to the library, and they had those weird devices pre-internet where you could like put in this thing and scroll in the old newspapers and stuff. And I remember looking up old reviews of this and Return of the Jedi when they first came out, and most of them were negative. And here's the thing, like, I do think that part of the reason, and I talked about this in the other video, that the reviews are way overwhelmingly positive now is due to nostalgia, due to the fact that most critics now are of an age where they were children or kids or possibly teenagers for more of the older critics when this film first came out, and so they grew up with it. And they had particularly all three films. They grew up with them, and it's sort of growing up with films gives you this sort of, it's part of your life, and you consider part of your life, and you look at it differently. You look at it from sort of a kid's eye rather than the way you would look at any modern films that you see for the first time as an adult, which is why I think a lot of critics had different views on it when it first came out, because they didn't grow up with the Star Wars saga. It wasn't like a huge legacy like it is now, and so they were just looking at it as they would analyze any other film. Now, that being said, I think a lot of these reviews were completely unfair of The Empire Strikes Back, and were not very accurate, and there were a lot of like snooty critics, I would say, who misunderstood the brilliance of this film. But all that being said, I feel like my love of the Star Wars trilogy was actually rooted a lot in my nostalgia for it, in the fact that I grew up with it, in the fact that it was part of my life from since I was a kid. But I think Empire Strikes Back, this film is the only exception where it still holds up to scrutiny. That if, say, for example, I've never seen this film before in my life, and I watched it now as an adult who likes to analyze and critique films as a hobby, it would still hold up for me. I would still love it, and I would still consider it a great film. I mean, I can only speculate as if I would consider it as great as I do. I would say probably not, because nostalgia does play a factor in growing up with it, and having it play such an important role in my childhood does make a difference. But I would still say it's a great film, but I don't actually think that's the case for the other two films in the trilogy, at least in my opinion. I know for a lot of people it's different. I think if I saw the original Star Wars, or A New Hope if you prefer, as an adult now, I would be very lukewarm on it. And same with Return of the Jedi. If I saw Return of the Jedi for the first time now, I would also say this is a very flawed film. Now, I'll cover Return of the Jedi, of course, next year, more when I get to it, but there's, from everything I'm reading and all the research I'm doing, I can see that George Lucas kind of had creator fatigue at that point, and kind of wanted to be done with the Star Wars franchise, which is kind of why it was the last film, or at least for several decades. It took him like how many it wasn't until 1999, so between 83 and 99, so what, 16 years before he finally got back to doing it. And granted, the creative fatigue wasn't anywhere near as bad as, say, Dan Dave's creative fatigue in Game of Thrones, which was just phenomenally huge, but it's there. And as I said, I'll analyze Return of the Jedi next year, and maybe I'll think more highly of it when I actually watch it again. But from memory, I think it's a very flawed film. Now, it's still good. I would still like it, probably more than A New Hope, for example, because I covered A New Hope last year, and I think A New Hope is too much built in with the serial based on Flash Gordon and all that sort of things, and it comes up as a bit too simplistic and too childish of good versus evil, and I talked about that last year. But another huge reason why I think Empire Strikes Back is the best of the original trilogy, which of course to me and to most people defaults it to being the best of the entire Star Wars franchise, because as I said, the prequel trilogy and sequel trilogy don't really stack up to the original trilogy, is because this is when George Lucas's heart was in it the most. Now, his heart was also in A New Hope, but in A New Hope there was a lot of studio interference. And in fact, I don't know exactly what and exactly how, but I do know that George Lucas, at least himself, felt like the studio was a real hindrance to his vision, so much so that when he made this film, he financed it himself. Which is, and this is something I just found out last year when I was doing research, because that's actually a pretty huge deal. That he, of course, he made like buttloads of money from the first Star Wars film, particularly the merchandising, which he had sole rights to, which they had, the studio at the time had no idea which would be so lucrative, and so he took that money and made this film. Now, he actually needed to get a bank loan as well, because even all that money he did have wasn't quite enough to fund such a huge blockbuster special effects heavy movie like this. Especially do with the justice that he wanted to do. Because he talked about how even before A New Hope came out, that he wanted to do these sequels and he was going to find a way, but he had a contingency, so if the Star Wars was kind of not really a failure, but wasn't the huge success that it was, if it was just did moderately well at the box office, he had a contingency to do like low budget versions of the sequels. But thankfully it was a huge hit, so he was able to do high budget outings of the sequels. Now, so it is very interesting though that he completely separated from the whole Hollywood studio, and obviously he felt they were interfering enough where he felt that, because it was a huge risk for him to fund the movies himself. But there was described throughout the filming of this film as a more sort of friendly demeanor, because apparently I talked about in A New Hope how there was a lot of setbacks and a lot of mistakes while filming, and Empire Strikes Back wasn't quite as bad, but there were still a lot of setbacks, a lot of delays. It took them longer, they went over budget, and director Irving Kershner described how it was unusual, because usually when this happens in a big budget film, they'd have to do with Hollywood producers ripping out their hair and making cuts and yelling at everyone, where George Lucas kind of just took it in stride and was like, okay, all right. and it made them the whole production actually run smoother, the fact that he wasn't like acting like a big Hollywood studio, so that was a benefit from it. Speaking of Irving Kershner, he directed this film, and I looked it up, and he was not his filmography is not huge. He did some like television shows and movies before this, and some television shows and movies after this, but nothing as huge as this. But apparently he was George Lucas's like professor at the university he went to, and so he knew that he was a good director. In fact, Lucas himself described Kershner as someone who Hollywood sort of abandoned and didn't recognize his brilliance, but Lucas knew him and recognized his brilliance. And of course, when Kershner even recounted about how when Lucas first approached him of directing the next Star Wars movie, he was like, "What? Are you out of your mind?" Like he didn't think he'd be able to handle a project of that scale. But I actually think his involvement, it was a huge reason why this is the best Star Wars film. Because he talked about how they sort of did a lot of improvising on set, and he sort of was involved in tweaking the script a bit to get it and to focus, because he said that his focus was more on the characters and making sure the character stories work. And if you know me, you know my opinion, I think that is the most important aspect of any story, that it is very character focused. And I do think that Empire Strikes Back is the biggest character focused Star Wars film, at least of the original trilogy. There may be some character-focused films in the prequels and sequels, but those are riddled with all sorts of other flaws that Empire Strikes Back does not have. So, Yeah, so it's interesting going back and again doing research for this film just now and learning things I was not aware of before, such as the fact that the script back in 1977 was originally written by a woman named Lee Brackett. Now, Brackett apparently was ostracized by the sci-fi community for writing more fantasy sci-fi and being a fan of the, sort of Flash Gordon serials and having a lot of sort of schlock in that regard. And apparently during this time period, and I think it lives up to even to today, where science fiction writing in particular is seen more of a serious hard science kind of thing. But you can see why that actually makes her a good choice to write a Star Wars film, because Star Wars, of course, is also inspired by the Flash Gordon serials and is more of a fantasy concept than the science fiction concept. Fantasy sci-fi. The Irvin Kershner even said, "I don't even think of this as a science fiction film; it's a fantasy film." And I've heard like modern nerds and critics today saying, "Oh, Star Wars isn't science fiction," which I think is absolutely absurd. Sci-fi fantasy is a branch of science fiction. Therefore, sci-fi fantasy is the specific genre it belongs to, but that is a branch of science fiction. So to say that it's not science fiction is inaccurate, but to say that it's strictly science fiction is also inaccurate. It is a sci-fi fantasy, but that is a branch of science fiction, so you can't say it's not science fiction anyway. That's a little that's a little pet peeve of mine. Regardless, so I found out that Lee Brackett had written the original script. Now, we know that George Lucas, and I talked about this last year when I covered A New Hope, that he had originally wrote Star Wars as one script or one story, but it encompassed what we now know of as the original trilogy. And so he decided before making Star Wars to separate it into 3 stories, and so he actually just filmed the first third of his original idea, and that is what we now know of as A New Hope. So he, even when making that film, that's why I said he had contingencies to make low-budget sequels if they weren't successful, because he wanted to ensure that he was able to finish his entire story, because he knew even back then, before he made the film and it was such a huge success, that it was only 1/3 of the story. So he had a vague idea of what he wanted the second act to be, but he considered it a second act. And now I've heard all this talk about how second acts are very tricky, because they're not really meant to stand alone. In which, in many ways, this film doesn't stand alone, but I'll talk more about that later. And so he didn't want to write it himself, because he recognized, rightfully I think, that writing is not his strong suit. And so he wanted to hire someone else to write the script. In fact, he also hired, as I said, another director. He wanted to take more of a hands-off approach to this film, and a lot of people ironically note this also part of the reason why this is the best Star Wars film. Now, George Lucas is the heart and soul behind Star Wars. There's no denying that, and Star Wars would not exist, nor would it be what it is without him. But George Lucas is more of an ideas man, and this is sort of noted whenever he gets more hands-on involved, that it's actually not as good. But when he's more of the general ideas man who sort of has the basic structure and outline and mythology and specific characters, then that's when everything is better. But when he hires other people who are sort of more skilled at their craft, writers and directors, to handle the finer details, that the story gets better. Which is another reason why Empire Strikes Back, I think, is the best Star Wars film. Now, granted, he did do the same thing with the Return of the Jedi, but Return of the Jedi also had a whole nother slew of issues, which, as I said, I will get to next year. So anyway, so the person he hired to write the script originally was Ree Brackett, and she wrote a first draft, which apparently is available online. I read summaries of it. I didn't read the whole thing itself. I don't really have that kind of time on my hands, but basically George describes not being very happy with it. However, a lot of what was in that first draft survived to the finished version, such as the Battle of Hoth, the sort of romance between Han Solo and Leia, and the confrontation at Cloud City, and other specific examples. Like Yoda training. Now, some of these ideas, of course, came from George himself, but she sort of helped to structure them and flesh them out more. But she died of cancer in 1978, so she was only able to write one draft of the script, and so after she passed away, Lucas hired Lawrence Kasdan, of course, who's known most from working on Raiders of the Lost Ark and writing other such films. And again, he's mostly known for Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But so he hired him to take over, and he was able to flesh it out more and come up with what we now know as The Empire Strikes Back. And again, is a brilliant writer, and so that's how this film ended up being great, because Lucas was leaning on great writers and great directors. Now, Lee Brackett's original idea apparently relied more on the love triangle between Luke, Leia, and Han. Now, and this is more reinforcement of what I was saying before when I talked about A New Hope, is that at this stage George Lucas did the idea of Leia and Luke being brother and sister was not thought up of until Return of the Jedi. I think I've seen some reports, even maybe interviews from Lucas himself, that suggest that he had envisioned Luke and Leia being brother and sister from the very beginning. That is utter nonsense. And I think that is very, very apparent here. Now, even in the finished draft of the script, there are a couple that Lawrence Kasdan did. There are a couple deleted scenes which you can watch. I watched on Disney Plus that further explore a romance between Luke and Leia that were cut. But even in the finished film, of course, you had that scene with Leia kissing Luke, which a lot of people, of course, look back now and shudder at the revelation of Luke and Leia being brother and sister. But again, I'll talk more about this when I get to Return of the Jedi, because that is an idea that was invented during the writing of that film. This film, that definitely was not the case. In fact, I talked about before how George Lucas' original idea was that Luke would have a sister, but she's an unknown character who would become a main focus of episodes 7, 8, and 9. Because I know a lot of people, when I try to say, oh, Luke and Leia weren't thought of brother and sister, they'll be like, they point to the scene where in this film where Yoda says, but there's another. But yeah, that's all he says, and he wasn't referring to Leia. That wasn't the original intention. The original intention is that he was referring to some unknown character we have yet to meet, who was Luke's sister. And also, Lucas talked about how part of the reason why that line of dialogue is so important is that it made the possibility of Luke dying off or being killed more probable, because we know that there's another replacement. So him dying off wouldn't be the end of things, although he's the main character. I don't think anyone seriously thought he was going to be killed off. But that was Lucas's reasoning anyway. So, talking more about the 9-episode ideas, which was invented between the filming of A New Hope and this film. So it was mainly, yeah, and basically during the writing of this film. And as I said, like the original script that Lee Brackett brought up did not have this larger idea. In fact, it was called Star Wars. The working title was Star Wars 2, or the second Star Wars film. And in that script, Luke's father was not Darth Vader. Now, this is something I do think that George Lucas did have in mind from the beginning, or at least that's what he says, and I can buy that. Maybe he didn't actually develop that more until he started working on this film. I can also buy that he maybe had that vague idea. I mean, because Vader apparently is a German word for father, so it was obviously there was some vague notion that, but maybe he didn't solidify this idea because there's nothing in A New Hope that would indicate it. In fact, I would argue there's the Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker's relationship or portrayals in that film kind of goes against them being father and son. But I'm able to, allow for the possibility that that is something, an idea that George Lucas had, even when coming up with the original story of Star Wars. But I don't think he solidified that idea until writing this film. So I think that's why, because obviously George Lucas gave Lee Brackett the general idea, gave her outlines, gave her his ideas of where he was going to take the story. And so the fact that she didn't put Darth Vader as Luke's father tells me that that is not something that he mentioned to her. So I think that's not something he knew specifically. I think it might have been an idea he had, but I think maybe after seeing her script, and in fact her script had Luke's father, who I think wasn't called Anakin at this stage, it was just like Master Skywalker, appeared to Luke as a Force ghost. And he's the one who told Luke about his sister. And he was just a loving father mentor. And I bet you that Lucas saw that script and was like, that's not very interesting. Wouldn't it be way more interesting if Darth Vader was his father? So, but anyway, so the whole idea of the 9 episodes was something Lucas came up with between the filming and release of A New Hope and the filming and release of this. And in fact, that was when it was being public knowledge. He talked about it in interviews, and he had this lofty ideas. Like, before New Hope came out, as I mentioned, he had the idea to do these 3 films, because he split his one idea into 3. But I don't think it was until after A New Hope, at least after it was written. Maybe before it was released, I don't know. But definitely after it was written, that he came up with the idea of, maybe I would say it's the success of the first one probably had a lot to do with this too. So I would say probably after it was released. Then he came up with the idea of having a prequel series and a sequel series, which of course is infamous because this is being referred to as episode 5. Was the first time, because as I mentioned before, when the first Star Wars movie was released, it did not say episode 4 or New Hope. They had retroactively added that to the film. I suppose you could even call that the first special edition, which was made, of course, in the late 70s. They added to the re-screenings of Star Wars episode 4 New Hope in anticipation for this film, which they had decided to call episode 5 The Empire Strikes Back. So that's when they had to explain to everyone, because that made no sense to people, because they were expecting this to be called Star Wars 2, and they're like, episode 5? What the hell are you talking about, episode 5? Where the hell are the first 3 episodes? So he had to explain that he came up with this whole backstory of there being a prequel trilogy that will explore, Darth Vader being Luke's father and his fight with Obi-Wan and the Clone Wars and all that was referenced. And then later, he would finish the stories with a sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9, which he did say back in the late 70s, early 80s, when this film first came out. So I think that was completely and totally his intention, was to do all 9 episodes. In fact, they talked about it, and I remember they saying in the news, "Oh wow, this is a very grand idea. It's not going to be done until 2001." Well, apparently it was a lot longer than that, because as I said, he kind of changed his mind. Because I remember hearing about this when I was like 4 or 5 years old, after Return of the Jedi came out, about this is going to be a prequel trilogy and this is going to be a sequel trilogy. But what I wasn't aware of is, because these were what it said in interviews during the time this film came out, and everyone was still had that in their heads. But what I wasn't aware of at the time is that George Lucas had already changed his mind and decided that he did not want to do it. In the second thought, let's not do that. Let's not go there. 'Tis a silly place. Mainly because of all of the hardships that he experienced with filming this film and filming Return of the Jedi. Now, for this film particularly, even though he didn't direct it or write it, as I said, the production was very behind over budget, so he did have to get heavily involved. He did have to step in, and apparently doing so took a huge toll on his personal life. In fact, shortly after the filming of this film, he divorced. Him and his wife divorced, and he sort of cites his involvement on this film of being so stressed out and never at home as being a main cause of that. And also his relationship with his children was strained by his own accounts because of the filming of this and Return of the Jedi. But after Return of the Jedi came out, he's like, I need a break. I remember hearing he needed to tend to his family, so that's why it was so long until after his children had grown up, until he actually went back to doing Star Wars, because he needed sort of a mental health. And it was a much more sort of healthier environment, the prequels, which is funny considering how worse they are. But yeah, there wasn't as much stress and as much toll to his personal life. But apparently, filming these 2 films, in particular, Empire and Jedi, took a huge toll on his personal life. So that's why he changed his mind about the whole episode. In fact, I remember, sort of for the longest time, even while they were making the prequels, George Lucas said he had no intention of doing episodes 7, 8, and 9. I mean, they only came about because Disney wanted to sell the cash dollar signs in their eyes and wanted to make more money. They saw a money opportunity. But, when he was writing and creating this film, he was totally all on board of doing episodes 1, 2, and 3, and 7, 8, and 9. But, of course, after his negative experience with making this film and the next one, he's like, screw episodes 7, 8, and 9. We don't need it. But so he originally had ideas, and reportedly, that idea would be Luke's sister would be, of course, heavily involved. And that's part of the reason why, and I'll get more to this next year again, why they decided to make Luke's sister Leia is because he abandoned the idea. By the time he was writing Return of the Jedi, he abandoned this idea of doing 7, 8, and 9, and so there was no reason to create this other character for Luke's sister. Which, in retrospect, I think that was not the best idea. Now, one other important thing I want to talk about in regards to Lucas's bad experience in making this film is apparently he got sued heavily by the I believe Writers Guild or Actors Guild, so a lot of guilds, Hollywood guilds, because apparently it was a huge no-no to have the credits, the opening credits, the way he did, where it doesn't feature any of the actors' names, where it's just, you get the long galaxy, long, far, far, far away, and then Star Wars in the crawl, and it goes straight into the film. That's a no-no, because you don't have any credits, any actors' credits, any directors' credits, any credits to the guild, when apparently they gave him permission to do that for the first Star Wars, because they didn't think it would be that no one would care. They thought the film would be a flop. But when it was a huge success and he wanted to do that again for the sequel, they said absolutely not. Negatory. But he was like, screw you. This is my creative decision. This works for the film creatively, so I'm going to do it anyway. So the guild actively tried to block the release of the film. They tried to prevent The Empire Strikes Back from ever being released, from ever coming out. And thankfully, hopefully, and probably naturally, because there was a lot of money involved in this, they failed. However, they did succeed at suing the pants off of Lucas, and they even sued Kirshner, the director, but Lucas very graciously offered to pay his fine instead. So Lucas ended up paying somewhere to upwards of $250,000 to the guild. So after this happened, of course, he was like, well, fuck you, guild, and was fed up with them. So he left the guild. Which is something, again, I'll talk more about when I get to Return of the Jedi, because that decision greatly affected that film. Because originally, the third film in the Star Wars trilogy was going to be directed by Steven Spielberg, who is friends with Lucas. Steven Spielberg wanted to do it. Lucas wanted him to do it. But because Spielberg was still part of the guild and Lucas was not, he was forbidden from working with him. Thus, they had to get a director outside of the guild, who probably not the best choice, but again, I'll get into that more next year. But yeah, so that fate sort of affected things, and it does make me kind of pissed off at the guild, for honest. You fucked things up so we couldn't have a Steven Spielberg directed Star Wars movie. I mean, god damn it, that would have been so good. And I have no doubt Return of the Jedi would have been a much, much, much better film had that been the case. But I mean, you could say Lucas was being stubborn. I mean, just put some actors' names in the film at the start, just satisfy the guild. But you know what? It does interfere with the artistic value, I reckon. That it's a classic motif of having the Star Wars going dun 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 in an opening crawl, and that. So I think the guild are fuckheads for doing it, personally. Anyway, let me finally, after all this time, get into some specific details on the movie itself. So I talked about the Luke, Leia, and Han love triangle and how in the original script this was a huge, huge thing. But even in the finished film, it's kind of a thing, and that's because they hadn't thought that Luke and Leia were going to be in it. They didn't know they were going to be brother and sister. So in retrospect, they had to name them brother and sister, which is probably why doing that in Return of the Jedi probably wasn't the best idea. Because this film exists. But they don't appear that much. And as I said, a lot of the scenes that do expound upon this more and have more of a romance angle with Luke and Leia were deleted, thankfully. So the only thing you really have is that one scene where she kisses him. Although, if you recall, she actually kisses him a second time at the end of the film after they rescue him from Cloud City. So there's that. But you know what? The Han and Leia romance aspect is, I've heard other people, and especially in retrospect with the nostalgic goggles on, say that this is one of the best love stories of all time, and they compare it to the Anakin and Padme love story and Attack of the Clones and point out how it's way, way better. And I'm sorry, but that's a low bar. Of course, I mean, it's not very difficult to be better than the anime, the Padme and Anakin freaking love scenes in Attack of the Clones, but I'll cover that eventually when I get to Attack of the Clones. So sure, it's better than that, but it's still, I don't know. It doesn't really work for me, and I don't think it ever really did. I mean, I do admit that the motif of him trying to sort of get her to realize that she loves him, and then she's in denial, and then at the end, when she finally says, "I love you," and he says, "I know," in response, right before being, frozen, that was awesome. That worked beautifully. It's definitely one of the huge strengths of the film. So I guess you don't have that without the romance. So the romance needs to be there so you can have that awesome motif at the end, which is amazing. But the actual romance scenes where she's like, "Oh, scoundrel," especially looking at it now from a more modern perspective, it does seem like he's kind of bringing a creeper stalker who's refusing to take no for an answer. And maybe it's not very pleasant or PC or modern or whatever to have Leia actually fall for that. But I don't know. The idea is that Leia was actually did love him, but was hiding her feelings for him. But if that is the case, there are better ways they could have portrayed that. They could have made it more clear. The way they did it just made her seem... In fact, I realized in this entire film, she just seems to be nothing but a nagging downer through most of the film, which is different than her portrayal in A New Hope, where she was in my opinion at least, a much stronger, more developed character, where here she's just constantly nagging at people, particularly Han, and being like, "Ooh, blah, blah." And there was in the deleted scene I mentioned with her and Luke, she even started nagging at him for going off to Dagobah. It's like, "You're leaving too, god damn it, blah blah blah." So I think they could have done more with her characters. So maybe it's one of my sort of more minor nitpicks on the film. However, as I said, the way they paid off this romance at the end of the film, absolutely brilliant, and added to how amazing this film is. So then there's the Battle of Hoth, which Lucas talked about how it was his idea to have the big battle scene at the start of the film rather than the end of the film, which I actually thought was kind of brilliant, because I don't think, they ended the first film with a huge battle scene, and to end the second film with a huge battle scene would be really repetitive. In fact, I think it was kind of repetitive, especially since it involved the Death Star in Return of the Jedi. But again, talk about that next year. And because as great as the battle scene on Hoth is, it's not really it doesn't. I think it works really well as a introductory piece of getting you into the film, because it doesn't really stand alone. There's nothing that spectacular about it by itself. It's kind of just like action fodder, which I think works towards the beginning of the film, because, as I said, it gets you into the world, gets you into the mindset of this action adventure. But as a huge finishing piece, I think it would be very disappointing. Now, you could argue that perhaps they would write it differently if it was the huge finishing piece, but I don't know. I still don't think it would work. I think what they did here was actually quite brilliant, because it established the main thing that established for the film going forward, and that I think is hugely important to differentiate this film from A New Hope, is how the rebellion is pretty much fucked, which is kind of the theme of this film that is called The Empire Strikes Back, is because the first film ends with this huge celebration, to destroy the Death Star, and everyone gets medals except for Chewie, of course, and everyone's clapping and cheering, and it's what a happy ending, we won. But here they kind of bring it back to reality, and part of that, as I talked about last year, I think had to do with studio interference, how they said they just needed to have a happy Hollywood ending. But this film, once Lucas has more creative control and was aware that it was going to be a trilogy and not just a standalone film, they have to bring it back to reality that actually, no, They didn't just win. The Empire is still a looming threat and still more powerful than the Rebellion. And how the Rebellion is still just a ragtag group of people who could be wiped out or in danger of being wiped out at any time. They are the underdog. And that whole Hoth battle sequence reinforces that. It makes that very clear. Now, you can say, okay, that's the whole Empire attacking Hoth, but what about the scenes with Luke being attacked by the Wampa or whatever they're called, and Han going out and save them? Well, to me, those, again, are more character-building scenes. As I said, this is probably the strongest character story in the Star Wars, at least the 9 episodes anyway. Because that develops a strong bond. It makes it clear the strong bond that Luke and Han and Leia as well, that they all had formed since the previous film. And it makes it very clear that Han was, the whole thing about, the guy trying to convince him not to go out and save Luke and saying that his tauntaun will freeze before the first marker, and he says, and I'll see you in hell! Like, that reinforces just how strong the bond is between these characters, which is actually very important because these characters are actually going to spend most of the film apart. So it's very important to establish how strong they feel about it at the start of the film when they're still together. So overall I think the whole thing is brilliant. Now, getting more to the Darth Vader Empire side of things. Again, this is what I think that this film, in my opinion, this is what made Darth Vader the best villain in film history, or at least one of the best. I think a lot of people probably say they still loved him, and he was probably thought up of a great villain even before this film came out, and they still loved him in A New Hope. But to me, he was more of a stereotypical, Flash Gordon-esque villain. And in fact, they talked about in Lee Brackett's original script that there was hardly any of this Imperial Empire stuff. So this is apparently more of Lawrence Kasdan working with George Lucas to develop all this material. And that in Lee Brackett's original script, he was more of your stereotypical evil. In fact, of course, he wasn't even Luke's father in that script, so he was just a stereotypical evil villain. And I think what she was working off of, she was basing this character off of the only thing she'd seen this character in, A New Hope. And I do think that's how he came off in that film. So I think it was kind of a natural assumption or progression for her to assume, well, this is what this character is. He's an evil bad guy, evil lord. Whereas George Lucas, of course, he had this larger story in mind and was trying to think, and in his wisdom realized that Darth Vader needed to be more than just that. And that's exactly how because it's funny, you could say that he's kind of a relatable character because he wants to be reunited with his son. But goes around, he's shown as really evil in this film. Like, he goes around just killing people right and left. In the New Hope, you did get that one scene where the guy was like, yo, no one believes in your old religion and sorcerous ways. And he starts choking him and is like, you lack blah, blah, blah. Was it, I find your lack of faith disturbing? That's what he says. Anyway, what he does here is actually much, much worse. And part of, some people account that to the fact that, what's-his-face, Grand Moff Tarkin isn't around anymore to, quote-unquote, hold Vader's leash the way that Leia said it, and so that he's kind of fancy-free. But I'd like to think that he was kind of doing this shit even before then, but we just didn't see it that much. And plus, like, his whole portrayal here to me is just way better than A New Hope. It's sort of more sort of subtle and low-key type evil, which is like, because for example, in A New Hope you had him say stuff like, You're part of the Rebel Alliance and therefore a traitor to the Empire. Take away! He's like almost yelling, "What?" And he's like freaking out and yelling. And the way at the end where he's like, "I have you now," and during the dog fight at the Death Star or whatever, it was a very cliche villain-esque. Where here, you get something like the best, like Arnold Schwarzenegger-esque one-liners, like when that dude loses the Millennium Falcon, he's like, "I'm going to apologize to Lord Vader in person," and the next thing you see him choking and dying, and he's like, "Apology accepted, Captain Nita." I mean, what an awesome one-liner! And it just shows you, it's just a much sort of darker, more complex, more adult, I would say. Almost like too adult for people who consider this a kid's film. That's quite violent in the way that and of course he's just like choking out like random people that work for him like crazy, because there's that other guy who apparently was dumb and didn't believe that the Hoth was there where the rebels were, and he took the fleet out of light speed, and as soon as he calls out Lord Vader to give him a status report, and it's like, "We dropped out of light speed," and just started force choking him, and it was like, "You're as clumsy as you're stupid," and then he just promotes the next guy. "You are in command, Admiral Navette." Is that his name, Navette? I'm surprised that guy survived the end of this film, because he's in Return of the Jedi, but at the end of the film, like, they think they had the Falcon, and he's like, Darth Vader asked him, "Did your people, disable the hyperdrive on the Falcon?" He's like, "Yes, Lord, it's all taken care of," but then the Falcon just light speeds away. And the way he looks at Vader is like, "Holy fuck, I'm dead." But Vader just walks away. But I'm surprised Vader didn't come back and kill him later. But yeah, he is such an effective villain in this film, and that is a huge strength of this film. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the music. Of course, I already talked about the music. John Williams' score is one of the things that it highly elevates this trilogy, and I think because the film itself and the material itself is so much better, I think that the music elevates it to an even higher amount. Where honestly, I think in the first film, A New Hope, the music is doing a lot of the legwork to make up for a somewhat, it's not a bad script, but it's definitely not as good as this one. So it doesn't have to do as much as the legwork, so it elevates an already great script. And I got to say, the whole Imperial March, which was created for this film, it wasn't in the first film, because Lucas himself talked about how he wanted a new theme just for Vader, and to really sort of emphasize what a badass evil guy he was. And John Williams talked about how the Imperial March theme was one of his favorite themes of that he ever created, and one that he loved. And in particular, I really love this one myself. Growing up, I had it on CD, and I used to listen to it repeatedly. It would be cool to like get stoned and like watch like lights in a dark room and have this music like blasting, dun 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 dun, and it's become just so well known, and it just in the public mindset as one of the. I would say it's probably the most iconic, well known Star Wars theme, even more so than the actual Star Wars theme itself. So yeah, and it used to like give me almost teary-eyed when I would see this film and hear that music. And it's just so iconic. It's just, I can't understate it. But yeah, that was also a huge strength of the film. And then you have the asteroid scene, which also has its own original music. That's dun, 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 which also hugely elevates the scene. And the whole way it was filmed, even though it might not be scientifically accurate, but come on, this is again fantasy sci-fi. It doesn't really have to be scientifically accurate. It's an amazing sequence that always had me on the edge of my seat, even when I was a kid. Which to this day is like one of the best film sort of chase scenes in space that you ever get. And it's funny because when I listen to that song, like on a CD or something separate from the movie, I don't like it as much. Like, I feel like the sound effects and the dialogue is like a part of that whole experience. To hear the TIE fighters going wah, 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 as they slam into asteroids and shit, that's like adds to the musical piece in my opinion. But anyway, another brilliant scene. The stuff with the Millennium Falcon being stuck in a creature, that's a bit too much to me. I mean, I suspend my disbelief for sci-fi, but yeah, that is very, very fantasy-esque. And not saying I don't like it. It's okay. But I will admit I liked it a lot more when I was a kid. It was sort of sparked my imagination a lot. Whereas as an adult, I don't know, it seems a little bit silly to me. But, and then one of the classic lines, I had all these lines. I know a lot of people quote a lot of these lines from this film and pop culture in general, but my personal experience, one of the lines I used to quote with my friends a lot is when Luke is in, after he escapes the Wampa cave and he's in the ice dying, and he sees Obi-Wan saying, "You will go to the Dagobah system." So one thing I would quote a lot is how Luke goes, "Dagobah system, Dagobah, Yoda!" And of course, he doesn't say Yoda as loud as that, but that's just something me and my friends would exaggerate. He does say Yoda a little bit louder. He just goes, "Yoda!" But we would like really exaggerate that. Whenever we were like tired or something, couldn't get up, we were like, "Dagobah system, Dagobah, Yoda!" Anyway, let's talk about Yoda. You will go to the Dagobah system. So, in Lucas's original script, which was supposed to be one movie, but he split it up into 3, Obi-Wan was the one who trained Luke in this portion of the film, but he wanted higher stakes in the first film, so he decided to kill off Obi-Wan. So then when he got to this part, he's like, "Oh, I don't have Obi-Wan anymore. What am I going to do?" So he created, let's have the Jedi Master who trained Obi-Wan. Who, of course, we find out in the prequels that he didn't actually train Obi-Wan. But let's set that aside, because prequels weren't even written for a couple decades from now. So let's forget about that. So let's have the Jedi Master who trained Obi-Wan train Luke. But I think in his wisdom, Lucas realized that it couldn't just be another old dude. That he needed to really differentiate him from Obi-Wan and make him a truly unique character. So instantly he thought of making him like a frog-like creature, which apparently is based off of a lot of fantasy writings where there's a frog-like imp creature that has a lot of wisdom and teaches people. And so he went to Jim Henson, who apparently was busy making a Muppet film, but he was all on board with the idea, so he sent Frank Oz to do it, who did an absolutely brilliant job. And apparently, and I didn't know this, apparently after this film came out, Lucas have spent tons of money trying to petition the Oscars, the Academy Awards, to nominate Frank Oz for Best Supporting Actor. But they refused to do it because they didn't see him as an actor. They saw him as a puppeteer. Which I can see their point of view. I think a worse example is the whole Gollum and the Andy Serkis thing in 2002, where he definitely should have been nominated for Best Supporting Actor, but they refused to do it because he was a CGI character. I think there was a stronger case for Andy Serkis being a supporting actor than Frank Oz because, yeah, I wouldn't consider Frank Oz to be an actor either. Maybe the voice actor for Yoda, but yeah, where Andy Serkis is way more than just a voice actor for Gollum. I mean, he was the puppeteer, but being a puppeteer is different. And plus, they had other puppeteers working for. But anyway, I mean, you can make the same argument with Gollum because you had digital, which artists working on him. But whatever. I don't know. In my mind, I think it was a clearer case for Andy Serkis being a supporting actor than Frank Oz. But anyway, I can understand why, because I think what they did with Yoda, actually, he became one of the most iconic characters of the entire Star Wars saga. It's interesting he wasn't created until this film, and the whole speech pattern is something that Lucas devised, again, to differentiate him from Obi-Wan or basically anyone we really know before that he would talk weird. But apparently, in Lucas's and Brackett's original drafts, that they didn't quite get the speech down and it sounded too weird. And when Lawrence Kasdan got involved, that he was able to refine it and make the speech more intelligible and sort of more iconic and basically what it is today. And one of my favorite things to do is to make jokes about Yoda grammar. I love any jokes about I can't think of any at the top of my head, but whenever I hear one, I love them so much. But anyway, because it is a sort of uniqueness to his character, yeah, I think. And another thing that I just learned today when doing research for this film, that the whole entire sequence when Luke first shows up and meets Yoda, and Yoda's acting like a crazy idiot because he's pretending not to be Yoda. He's pretending just to be some green, weird guy who will take him to Yoda. That the whole sequence where Yoda is like going through Luke's shit and throwing his food around, and he has to fight with over the flashlight with R2D2, and it's mine. That's another thing. By the way, I used to quote a lot. I used to do a really good Yoda impression. I'm not sure if I'm that good anymore. Away with your weapons! I mean you no harm. I am wondering, why are you here? Ooh, great warrior. War does not make one so great. Yeah, not the best Yoda impression, but I saw a play once of The Empire Strikes Back, and they had an actor who played Yoda, and I think I did a better impression than she did personally, but that's just me. Anyway, so that whole sequence with him fighting, being like, going through this, that was improvised on set, which is very impressive considering it's a puppet. They improvised that is something that the director, Irving Kirshner, came up with because he wanted this whole funny sequence, and it's amazing. I remember watching it as a kid, actually laughing my ass off. I think that is a great sort of levity to this very otherwise dark and serious film, to have this funny looking character, and it makes the revelation that, hey, this is actually Yoda. But of course, when I was old enough to actually watch this movie and comprehend it, I already well knew who Yoda was. I've seen Return of the Jedi by this stage, so I knew all the characters, so it wasn't a shock. But I would imagine if I could put myself in the mindset of someone who's watching this film for the first time without any prior knowledge of Star Wars, that it would have been such a more powerful revelation that this is in fact Yoda. So I think that the whole sequence is absolutely brilliant. Now, Yoda, a lot of people, the Honest Trailer referred to Yoda, it's just Buddhism with puppets or whatever. But a lot of the philosophy and the wisdom that he espouses is based on many religions, not just Buddha. Buddhism is probably the one that's most apparent. But Lucas's goal was to... He said that his personal philosophy was that since there's all these religions that exist, his idea that he always liked in his head was that they were all right, that they all had portions of the truth. So that was what he aimed to do with creating the religion of the Force. And Yoda is to have take aspects from all sorts of religions and kind of blend them together and to come up with this other sort of religion of there being a force, and how Yoda is saying, try not, do or do not, there is no try. By the way, I disagree with that statement, but that's another topic. But the whole thing about the detachment and from one's emotions and all that's very Buddhist. But yeah, so the whole sequence in Dagobah was amazing. The whole Yoda, I mean, I think is probably the most, even more so than Darth Vader, the most iconic thing of the Star Wars franchise. And it's the fact that you get this amazing Yoda scenes that was... Yoda's other appearances never as good as this. This is like the iconic, and I think I can say with pretty strong certainty that goes beyond nostalgia. That this is the best crafted, best written Yoda performance ever. And it was, again, another factor of what makes this film so brilliant. So, this film introduced another character, Boba Fett, who I think a lot of people make a lot bigger deal of because he's barely in this film. And he's barely in Return of the Jedi, and that's even worse because he just promptly dies. But again, I'll get to that next year. But it's funny because, and George Lucas invented, or was, the character Boba Fett was created for the Star Wars Holiday Special. Something that George Lucas would like to erase from existence. But there was an animated cartoon that appeared in the special that featured Boba Fett, but he liked the idea of Boba Fett himself. And they said that earlier original drafts of the script didn't have Boba Fett, it just had random bounty hunter. But they decided they wanted a clear villain who's very much based off of like samurai, or they also said it was based off of the stranger in the westerns who was like the hired gun bad guy who was the badass that the hero was trying to escape from, who was more of like the silent type, which makes a lot of sense considering the Mandalorian was very much based off of a western, so there's always that western vibe to it, and I think a lot of people sort of latched, particularly fans who like to obsess over every tiny little detail of the trilogy, latched on to this character because I think he does work extremely well in that role. He is like he's portrayed as the badass silent type. In fact, unlike Return of the Jedi where he just promptly dies, he is not defeated here. He's the one who finds Han and leads Darth Vader to them, and he gets away with Han, so he is portrayed as the badass here. So his role in the film was very effective. I agree, and it is again a strength of the film, but he barely appears in it. That's why I can't be all excited about doing a Boba Fett show. Plus, it's more of, they're basing it more off of like the Clone Wars cartoons or the prequels, and having them played by Timumaru Morrison, great New Zealand actor. But to me, that modern portrayal of Boba Fett, like particularly in Mandalorian season 2, and then having his own show, to me, it's a totally different thing than the Boba Fett we see in this film. It's hard for me to even equate them as the same character, personally, but that's just me. Anyway, that's why I'm not excited about a Boba Fett show. I don't really care. But regardless, there's also the Cloud City sequence, which I love. Again, this is another thing that really sparked in my imagination as a kid. Lando was a great character who, another sort of scoundrel type to play off of Han, who ends up betraying Han, but then saving Chewie and Leia. And yeah, that whole sequence is amazing. And I tell you, I talked about the special editions when I talked about A New Hope. And how the special editions, of course, kind of ruined A New Hope and made it worse. But the special editions in Empire Strikes Back, they're barely noticeable. They didn't change much. And one of the things they did change is adding more scenery to these Cloud City scenes. Instead of there just being a white wall, you could actually see like out the window to the clouds. And like when Lando makes his sort of evacuation speech saying, "Everyone, I suggest you leave because the Empire is taking over." Like in the original theatrical version, you just see Lando, but in this version, they show like different people, parts of the cities, all these landscapes of people listening to this announcement. And honestly, I think that improves the film. So that's why when I wanted to watch A New Hope, I wanted to actively seek out these like despecialized versions that had the original theatrical version, but I don't know, I was too lazy, I ran out of time, I couldn't be bothered doing it, and so I thought, I'll do it this time for Empire, but then I thought, there's no point, because I actually don't think the Empire is much worse. Now, a lot of people think that the Wampa scene where they show the Wampa eating this shit and going after Luke, they say that diminishes the scene because the scene works better if you just hear the creature in the background, don't see him. Honestly, I don't care. It works, either way works for me. I don't think it makes a difference, in my opinion, personally. And then the other scenes that are different, and these are more actually not specialized, but these are more came later in 2004 when they came out on DVD. They changed the scene with the Emperor, where they have the same actor who plays the Emperor in Return of the Jedi in the prequels, and they changed the dialogue too to have it so it fits more with the prequels. And honestly, I like that better too, because it's it makes more sense. I like that it matches. And honestly, growing up watching these films, I never liked that scene with the Emperor because I don't think that even matches up with Return of the Jedi. Like even years before the prequels came out, I thought, well, this scene doesn't really work. I don't think it really matches up with Return of the Jedi. It doesn't really make sense. However, the one flaw that there is in the new scene that they added is they're saying that this is when the Emperor first makes Vader aware that Luke Skywalker is his son. First of all, he already knows his name is Skywalker, so that should be a tip-off. Secondly, I think the first part of the film kind of hints that because Darth Vader is obsessed with finding Luke, even that first part of the film, and the fact that he knew that he was on Hoth, like as soon as he saw the things, he's like, that's where they are. It's implied that he has this special connection because he's Luke's father. So I think the way it was filmed originally intended Darth Vader to already be aware that Luke was his son at this stage. So having this scene in here kind of doesn't fit that, but other than that, I still love it, and I still think it works. They had Tim Morrison's voice over Boba Fett. That's another thing they did for the DVDs to make it match with the prequels, and that I don't know. It still throws me off. I was still used to the old original voice that was there, but I don't know if I'd go as far as to say I prefer the special editions to the original theatrical version, but I mean, I don't think it makes it much worse the way that the New Hope does and Return of the Jedi. So when I get to Return of the Jedi, I actually might seek out the original version because that special edition, that definitely makes it worse. Anyways, Empire is like the one that was kind of least touched or least damaged, at least by the one thing that they did totally damage that was in the original special editions that they released in the theaters in 1997 was when Luke fell off of, when Vader had this big reveal and Luke just dropped off the ledge. They added in the sound effect of the Emperor screaming when he fell off of the ledge in Return of the Jedi. They added that exact same screaming sound effect to when Luke was falling. And that bothered the fuck out of me. I'm like, you can clearly tell that's the Emperor's voice, not Luke's voice. And plus, I thought the scene was way more powerful where Luke is sort of, he accepted that he was going to die, that he would rather die than join Darth Vader. And so there's a sense of acceptance to it. For him to be yelling, "Ah!" especially since it's the fucking Emperor's voice, that was terrible. But thankfully, they actually took that out with the 2004 DVD, so they corrected that mistake. So the version you watch now on Disney Plus doesn't have that. So, or if you watch it on DVD or Blu-ray, it won't have it. So that, you know, they fixed the one issue with the special edition, so it's actually fine now. Anyway, speaking of Luke Skywalker's confrontation with Vader. This again was another sort of there's been a lot of people smarter than me who analyzed the theme of this film as failure, which is funny because they try to do this again for The Last Jedi, which is also the second film in the trilogy, and I think they definitely don't do as good of a job as they do here. I think that's even though I do appreciate that film, I do like portions of it. It's obvious they're trying to be too on the nose with that theme, where here I think they're a lot more subtle with it, and I think it actually works a lot better. And the whole fight between Luke and Vader at the end, again, this is such a better decision to have this be the end piece of the film rather than just another big, starship fight. Dogfight type thing, because that would have been way too repetitive. And again, it shows how this is why I think this is probably the best, or at least one of the best. I would argue maybe the best sequel of all time. That because it's so different and original from the first film. It keeps all the stuff that worked with it, but improves upon it and does something different instead of just repeating the same thing, which is a problem many sequels fall into. And so, yeah, the strength of that fight between Vader and Luke at the end is because it shows how out of his depth Luke is, just how overpowered he is by Vader, and just how screwed he is, and to the point where he ends up losing his hand. And then you add on that huge revelation, which of course, when I was old enough to understand this movie again, I was well aware that Vader was Luke's father. So I never had that sort of shocking moment that people who were much older when this film first came out had, were like, oh my god. And apparently, like, James Earl Jones himself, still until Return of the Jedi came out or was being made, he thought that Darth Vader was lying. And many people just couldn't believe it. And it was such a powerful revelation. And especially in the way that it is. That's why it's become definitely iconic. One of the most iconic moments in Hollywood history. Even though a lot of people misquote it. That's another thing, saying that, Luke, I am your father, but it's no, I am your father. Let's get it right. Anyway, it's so amazing in delivery and build up that Luke screwed. And this is really why I think, another reason why I think this is one of the best films ever made, and definitely the best film in the Star Wars saga, is that and I think maybe this is another reason why it didn't sit well with a lot of audiences and critics when it first came out, is because it is unique. Because Lucas was looking at this as the second act of a 3-act structure, which is common nowadays with films, and you have all these sagas and whatnot. But back then, it was kind of unheard of. Especially in Hollywood terms. I mean, you had serials, but those were something totally different back in the 50s and 40s. In basic Hollywood terms in the 70s and 80s, this was sort of unheard of, to have something with such a dark ending. Especially, type of film that's seen as a more like your stereotypical kid-friendly action adventure film. Of course the hero always wins. That's how Hollywood films work. But Lucas was looking at this more as a second act. And at the second act, the hero always loses. Which people are okay with in a singular movie, because then they can watch the third act before the movie's over and see the hero win. But to have the movie end, and when you're left with Luke was just had his arm chopped off, had the devastation of realizing that his father was this evil man that he hated, and that Han Solo's frozen and they don't know where it is, and they're going off to look for him. And then they end the film. And I can see why this bothered a lot of people. Maybe, in hindsight, the reason why this never bothered me is because I already had seen Return of the Jedi, or could simply just watch it immediately. I never had to wait 3 years for it to come out. The way that people who did when they first saw this film. However, I do think, and this is something I talked about on a lot of other movies I covered, I think in modern times, it actually irritates the hell out of me when people compare some modern films that are just part 2 or part 3 or whatever, just a part in a series of movies that end abruptly, and they compare it to Empire Strikes Back and be like, well, you're complaining it ends abruptly, but Empire Strikes Back ends abruptly. Where I think there are a lot of modern examples that just does not hold. Modern times, I think they don't get the formula right the way this film did. That they are too, it's more of a cash grabby, let's force you to watch the next film kind of thing, where this was more of an artistic choice that actually works and was built to, and that Empire Strikes Back, even as a film on its own, stands on its own. It does stand on its own, as having its own three-act structure, and the ending is not too abrupt. It does have a sense of conclusion because they get Luke back. He's reunited with Leia, and he finds out that Darth Vader is his father. So it does, even though there's a lot of things left hanging for the overarching story, the film itself does have a sense of finality. And I think there's a lot of modern films that don't have that. They just cut it. I think the 2 worst examples I can think of is The Hunger Games, the second film, which I don't think is nearly as good as most people. Most people say that's the best of all the Hunger Game films, where I think the last one was the best, personally. And I think the first one's better than the second one, because the second one is just repeating the first one. Anyway, that ends extremely abruptly. And people are like, but Empire Strikes Back. No! Empire Strikes Back did it correctly. But an even worse example, the worst example in my opinion, where I had joked about this on my channel before, that they might as well just cut the character off mid-sentence and just cut the credits, was The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, which was the second film in that trilogy. Now, The Hobbit was a very flawed trilogy that did not work at all, and there's many issues with it. But to me, that is the worst movie ending ever. Because they should have, if you don't recall, there's like, Smaug went off to kill the town, and Bilbo was like, oh no, and they just cut the fucking credits. What? And then in the third film, they have Smaug attacking the town, and that lasts for like 15-20 minutes, and then they have like the opening title after that sequence, and then the rest of the film deals with a completely different story. The whole sequence with Smaug attacking the town should have been resolved at the end of the second film. Is absolutely ridiculous, and to an nth degree, that they just cut the film right there before resolving that storyline. People are, but the Empire Strikes Back. No, it is nothing like The Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Strikes Back is the standalone movie that stands on its own, that ended in a brilliant place, that resolved enough that needed to be resolved, and left hanging what needed to be hanging for the first film. Where this is just in the middle of the fucking story. They could have just cut him off mid-sentence because I know how to defeat Smaug. How we do it is directed by Peter Jackson. That's what they might as well should have done. God damn it! Sorry. Anyway, that infuriates me when people bring up the name of Empire Strikes Back to justify these modern movies that don't know how to fucking end properly. They're nothing like Empire Strikes Back. Anyway, I think there's some other examples too that I'm forgetting, but I remember getting into an argument with Josh on one of the live discussions we did several years ago, but I can't remember what movie it was, but whatever. I think maybe it was Walking Dead. Yeah, people tried to bring it up with the Walking Dead season ender. That was the worst cliffhanger in history, and be like, oh, Empire Strikes Back. Don't. Anyway. My rating for the Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, out of 10 is a 10, the best. And spoilers, it's the only movie in the Star Wars saga I gave a 10 to. I am reaffirmed that I think this is the only truly great film in this whole Star Wars saga. There are other good films. I'm not saying it's the only good one. There's some other good films. Some films I might even call great. Well, not great. As I said, this is the only truly great one. But I might call them like really good. But no. This is the only one. This is the only 10. This is the only one where I think they got the formula totally right, because this is when Lucas was unburdened by the studio. He was able to do it correctly. This is also when he got more people who were more skilled at him at doing specific tasks, such as directing and writing, where he still was able to oversee the overall story and make sure it wasn't interfered with by the studio, because he financed it himself. And it's when he was most into it, because Return of the Jedi, as I said, there was a lot of external issues, and he was having a lot of personal issues, and he had a bit of creative fatigue. And in the prequels, that's a whole other story. He had too much control, and he was surrounded by yes men who just wanted to do, and he didn't have as much creative people who were in positions of control the way they were here. And of course, the sequel trilogy was a Disney cash grab, which he was barred from being involved with. So, this is kind of your perfect mix. This is the perfect formula. This is where everything came together perfectly to make the perfect Star Wars film. And I don't think it was ever achieved or will ever be achieved. Not only do I think it's the best Star Wars film, but as I said, I think it's the only really great one. The other ones, all of them, have their issues. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Empire Strikes Back. Happy May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to check back with me next year as I celebrate May the 4th once again with Return of the Jedi. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many more reviews on Star Trek, The Expanse, The Outer Limits, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks so much for watching.